Hey guys, today we are officially starting chapter 2. All right, we are finished with chapter 1. You took your test yesterday, or maybe just have a little bit left to finish up. But today we're going to get rolling right into chapter 2, which is going to be about fractions, decimals, and percents. These are some things you probably have heard of before, so let's get into it. Today's focus is going to be taking decimals and fractions and trying to transfer between one and the other. So if I gave you a decimal, you should be able to make it into a fraction. If I give you a fraction, you should be able to make it a decimal. So we're going to practice through those today. Let's start by just looking at some basic real-world links here. So if I was leading an orchestra here, right, I have 4 different types of instrument. I have brass, percussion, woodwind, and strings. So if I were to be given a group of kids and I wanted to figure out what fraction or what decimal of the kids would be making up the orchestra and what instruments they play, I could split up that 100% or split up the 100 kids if we were looking at it that way and make them into decimals and fractions. So if I were to say that 0.25 of the orchestra are brass players, how could I say that in word form? Well, if you know how to do your place value, you should know that 0.25 is 25 hundredths, right? Because 5 is in the hundredth spot, 2 is in the 10th spot, so 25 hundredths. All right, and then if I was writing 25 hundredths as a fraction, think about what it sounds like, 25 hundredths. So that's going to be 25 over 100. And if I'm smart, we're not going to get to this step quite this early in the Edpuzzle here, but if I took 25 over 100 and I broke it down even further, we know that eventually that's going to get down to 1/4 in simplest form. All right, let's look at percussion here. If I'm looking at percussion, it says 0.15. 5 is in the hundredth spot, so we're going to call this 15 hundredths, right? Which would be 15 over 100. So 15 out of the 100 players in the orchestra, the musicians in the orchestra, are going to be percussion players. Strings, we have 0.31. So that means 31 hundredths or 31 out of 100. So I think you could do this last one. If I had woodwind and I have 0.29, what is that in word form? You should have said 29 hundredths because that 9 is in the hundredth spot and 2 is in the 10th spot. So that's going to be read as 29 hundredths. What would it be over a fraction? Good. 29 over 100 would be 29 hundredths. So then if you're looking at these fractions and these decimals, if there's a way that you can break them down into simplest form, we're always going to want to do that, which we're going to practice here in just a second. So here it says rewrite decimal and fractions. We can write decimals as fractions and mixed numbers. So if you think about decimals like 0.25, 0.15, 0.31, the ones that we just did in the last slide, 0.29, we can take those decimals and we can actually make them fractions, which we just did. Typically, we want those denominators to be 10, 100, and 1,000 because that's going to make sense with place value. So decimals like 3.25, that's going to have that bigger number in front. That's going to be a mixed number. So that means we have 3 wholes and then 0.25 of the next whole. So we can take those decimals that are mixed numbers and also write them as well. So let's start by writing decimals as fractions in simplest form. So the first example I'm going to walk you through here. If I was given a decimal like 0.6, you see it right over here, 0.6. We're not going to call it 0.6. We're going to use our place value chart. I see that 6 over here is in the 10th spot. So instead of saying 0.6, we're going to say 6 tenths. Okay, 6 tenths. So if you say 6 tenths out loud, you should be able to write that as a fraction, 6 over 10. And then you guys are smart. You can figure out if there's any number that can go into 6 and 10 to make it smaller, right? So I know that I can divide 6 and 10 both by 2. If I divided 6 by 2, I'm going to get 3. If I divide 10 by 2, I'm going to get 5, which means that 6 tenths in simplest form is going to be 3 fifths. So that's a quick example of how you would do it if you just had it in the 10th spot. Let's do another example. If I were to be given this decimal, well, now I see I'm 2 decimal spots over, so I'm in the hundredth spot. So I'm going to read this as 45 hundredths. Okay, so 45 over 100. A little hint to you: if you ever see a fraction that ends in a 5 or a 0, we know that 5 goes into that. So I know that I can take a 5 out of 45, and I know that I can take a 5 out of 100. So if I did 45 divided by 5, I'm going to get to 9. If I did 100 divided by 5, I'm going to get to 20. And those of you that use your multiplication charts often, you are more than welcome to use those for fractions as well to try to figure out which number goes into the numbers to make them simpler. So the simplest form of 45 hundredths is going to be 9/20ths. Looks like I'm frozen here. All right, now let's have you try one here. So if I were to give you this one, 0.8. you're going to read that as 8/10. So that might help you get started here, 8/10. Okay, if you did this one correctly, you should be looking at your place value chart. You should notice that the 8 is in the tenths spot, so you would read that as 8/10. So if you were to write that as a fraction, you should have put 8/10 because that's 8/10. And then you should be looking at those two numbers. Can I take anything out of 8 and 10 that they would have in common, a common factor? Well, I know that 2 goes into 8 and 2 goes into 10. So if I divide by 2 for 8 and 10, I'm going to break that down to 4/5. 8 divided by 2 is 4, 10 divided by 2 is 5. So the simplest form of 0.8 or 8/10 is going to be 4/5. Hopefully that's the answer you came to. All right, now let's talk about writing decimals as mixed numbers in simplest form. This one gets a little tricky, but don't overthink it because we're just going to focus on the fraction part of it. So in this example, it says the average length of a conch shell is 9.85 inches or 9 and 85 hundredths of an inch. Express 9.85 as a mixed number in simplest form. So when we are doing mixed numbers, we always want to look at the number before the decimal point first. So if I see that it's a 9 point something or 10 point something or 3 point something, we actually just get to keep that the same. We don't have to change anything because we're not going to split up the holes, right? We already have 9 holes. So I'm going to keep the 9 in front. So you see the 9's here, and even at the very end in our answer, the 9's still out to the side. So you don't really have to do anything with that. You just keep that big number out to the side. Then we have to look at the decimal though. So it says 0.85. We know we can read 0.85 as 85 hundredths. So we were saying really here 9 and 85 hundredths. So then all we have to do after we put that into fraction form is break this number down until we get to simplest form. Again, I see a 5 and a 0, so I know that 5 is going to go into it. So if you divide 85 by 5, you're going to get to 17. If you do 100 divided by 5, you're going to get to 20, which means that 9 and 17/20 is going to be our simplest form of this decimal right here, 9.85. All right, you try one here. It takes approximately 4.65 quarts of milk, or 4 and 65 hundredths of quarts of milk, to make a pound of cheese. Express this amount as a mixed number in simplest form. So first off, you're going to want to take that number and you're going to put it as a fraction. Once you put it as a fraction, you are going to want to take that decimal part of the fraction and you're going to try to make that into simplest form. So let's get you set up here. If you had 4 and 65 over 100, 4 and 65 hundredths, which is why I wrote that as a fraction right here, how could you simplify that to make it smaller? All right, you should have remembered that we are going to keep this 4 the same, right? We're going to always keep that 4 there, so we don't do anything with that. All we have to do is take the 65 over 100 and make it smaller. We should see again that we see a 5 and a 0, so we know that 5 is a factor. So if I divide by 5 for both of these, 65 divided by 5, 100 divided by 5, I'm going to end up with 4 and 13/25 because 65 divided by 5 is 13, 100 divided by 5 actually should be 20. I did that math wrong. 100 divided by 5 actually should be 20, so this should actually be 4 and 13/20. So the 4 stays the same, 13 changes, and 20ths should be at the bottom here, which is one of your answer choices in the add puzzle. All right, let's move on to writing fractions and mixed numbers as decimals. So this is kind of flip-flopping the order. So if I were to give you a fraction, could you write it as a decimal? So here's our next example. If I had the fraction of 9/12, there's two ways that you can do this. All right. So if method one, if I were to write this fraction as a decimal, I can just find the equivalent fraction. So I know that if I have 9/12, I can make that equal to 3/4. I can simplify it to 3/4 because I can divide by 3 and divide by 3. And then I know, being a good math student, that 4 can go into 100, right? 4 times 25, you think of money like quarters, 4 times 25 is going to get me to 100. So 3 times 25 gives me to 75. 4 times 25 is going to get me to 100, which really means that you have 75 hundredths. So when you say 75 hundredths out loud, we should know how to write that as a decimal because we just practiced that. So this would be 0 and, which was our decimal point, 75. 0 and 75 hundredths is how I could write that as a decimal. You might want to pause for a second and rewatch this section so you can kind of look here on the inside to see how they change that up. All right, and the second method you could do, especially if you get to numbers that don't work super well with 100 or 10 or whatever the denominator might be, you can just divide them. All right, so if I have 9 over 12, that's really like a division problem. I can do 9 divided by 12. So if I put 12 on the outside, put 9 on the inside, add a couple placeholder zeros, and I could actually divide it out as long as I remember how many decimal points I did afterwards. So since I put 9 here, that's my whole number, I could really say this is like 9.0000, keep going, right? And I know that I'm 2 decimal points over. So as I start working out this problem, I just have to remember to keep that decimal points 2 over, which is going to get us to our 75 hundredths right here. So either way works for me. All right, here's another example. If I had 1 and 3/8, it says write the length of the caterpillar as a decimal. So I remember with the mixed number, nothing is going to change as far as that whole number on the outside goes. We're going to keep that a 1, but then we have to worry about the fraction. So I have 1 plus 3/8, right? 1 whole plus 3/8 of another one. So this one, they took this and they took it times 125 to get to 1,000. So they took this 8 and they took it all the way out to get 1,000, which you could do to figure out that it's 375 over 1,000. Or probably the simpler way would just to be divide this 3 and the 8 together. So if you did 3 divided by 8, you would also end up with 0.375, which means that the decimal form of this fraction is 1.375. Or the best way I could read this is 1 and 375 thousandths, because we're in the thousands place, of an inch. All right, you try one. Break it down step by step here. Write the following fraction as a decimal. So if you had 27 over 75, what could you do here? All right, you could have done a couple different things. To me, I figured since this is 75, I know that I can eventually get that to 100. So I'm going to try to get this to 100. So if I take this 75 and divide by 3, I know I can bring this down to a 25. 75 divided by 3 is 25. And then I just have to do that to the top. So 27 divided by 3 is 9. So if I get this fraction right here, I find an equivalent fraction, which is 9 over 25. Now I can take this 9 over 25 and I can multiply it by 4. Because if I multiply it by 4, I know that I can get this 25 to be 100 at the bottom. So we're always trying to make these fractions something with a 10 or 100 or 1,000 at the bottom. All right, so we're not usually going to get into the 10,000, so don't stress out about that. So 25 times 4 is 100. 9 times 4 is 36. So then if I'm looking at this first fraction that I was given, I can see that 27 over 75 equals 36 hundredths, because 36 over 100 is going to be written like this, 0 and 36 hundredths. So that's kind of the process that I went there. So I tried method 1 on that example there. Or again, you could divide them out. So if I did a long division problem, I could do 75 or 27 divided by 75, and I could work out the long division here, and we can work through some of these in class, and I still would have gotten 0.36. Okay, so 36 hundredths is still going to be my final answer. All right, guys, that's it for today. I know this was a lot. We have to practice this in class. It's okay if you missed a few of these today. We're going to talk about it, but make sure you let me know if you have questions tomorrow in class, or if you're an online learner, make sure you email me and we can work through some together through Google Meet. Have an awesome day, and let me know if you need anything.